Have you ever wanted something so badly that you ignored every warning sign telling you it was a terrible idea? Vecna stood at the edge of reality, staring into the warp. Not metaphorically, literally. He had found a thin point in space where the barrier between the material universe and the Imperium was weak enough to see through. The view was both beautiful and horrifying. The warp looked like an ocean made of screaming colors that shouldn't exist. Purple merged with sounds. Red tasted like rage. Shapes that were also emotions twisted through currents of pure thought. It was chaos in its most literal form. Reality without rules. Existence without physical laws. A dimension where consciousness itself was the building material. And Vecna wanted in. He had been studying the warp for months now, ever since arriving in the Warhammer 40k universe. Every culture he encountered spoke of it with fear. The Imperium called it the Sea of Souls and the Realm of Chaos. The Eldar called it She Who Thirsts, remembering how their own excess had birthed the Chaos God. Even the Orcs had a crude understanding of it, their Wyak. Energy drawing power from the same psychic dimension. But Vecna saw what others missed. The warp wasn't just a source of corruption and demons. It was a path to true immortality. In his home universe, Vecna had achieved a form of godhood. He had worshippers, divine power, the ability to grant spells to his faithful. But it was limited. He needed rituals, prayers, physical anchors. His consciousness was still bound to his phylactery, a magical item that could theoretically be destroyed. He was powerful, yes, but not truly immortal, not truly free. The warp offered something different. Can you imagine existing as pure thought, pure power, never needing a body or physical form again? Vecna had studied the chaos gods obsessively. Khorne, the blood god, who drew strength from every act of violence across the galaxy. Nurgle, the plague father, who grew more powerful with every moment of despair and acceptance of death. Slaanesh, the dark prince, who fed on excess and sensation of all kinds. And Tsench, the changer of ways, who thrived on ambition, hope, and the desire for transformation. They were eternal, impossible to kill because they weren't really beings, they were concepts given form. As long as mortals felt rage, despair, desire, and ambition, the chaos gods would exist. No weapon could harm them. No spell could banish them permanently. They were woven into the very fabric of existence itself. That was what Vecna wanted. Not the corruption, not the madness, but the fundamental immortality that came from being an idea rather than a creature. He had learned how they did it. The chaos gods were born from the collective psychic energy of countless mortals. Their power came from belief, from emotion, from the unconscious thoughts of billions of minds across the galaxy. They existed in the warp because that's where psychic energy pooled and concentrated. And if the Chaos God could do it, why couldn't he? Vecna had advantages they didn't have. He understood magic from a universe where it operated on different rules. He had knowledge of reality manipulation that predated the warp itself. He had willpower forged over thousands of years of existence. He wouldn't be a slave to mortal emotions like the Chaos Gods were. He would transcend his physical form while maintaining his identity, his purpose, his will. At least, that's what he told himself. Have you ever been so confident in your own intelligence that you assumed you understood something better than everyone who warned you against it? The ritual Vecna had designed was complex, drawing on multiple magical traditions. He used warp energy, yes, but filtered through techniques from his own universe. Necromancy to separate his consciousness from physical form, transmutation to convert matter into pure psychic essence, divination to ensure his identity remained intact during the transformation. He had chosen his location carefully, a dead world on the edge of a warp storm, where the barrier between realities was thin but not completely broken. He needed access to the warp without being immediately overwhelmed by it. The ritual circle was inscribed in the ash with symbols from a dozen different magical languages. Some were from his home universe. Others he had learned by studying chaos cultist texts. A few he had invented himself, bridging the gap between different types of magic. At the center of the circle sat Vecna's physical form, the lich body he had maintained for millennia. Skeletal, preserved through necromancy, enhanced with the eye of Vecna and the hand of Vecna. It had served him well, but it was still a limitation, still vulnerable. He was ready to shed it like a snake shedding old skin. Power without form, Vecna whispered, beginning the incantation. Consciousness without flesh, immortality without anchor. I claim the privilege of gods and the freedom of thought itself. The ritual circle blazed with light, not normal light, but the impossible colors of the warp bleeding through into reality. Vecna felt his physical body beginning to dissolve, not dying but transforming, converting from matter into pure psychic energy. It hurt. Emperor's throne, it hurt. Every nerve ending screamed as flesh became thought. His bones didn't break. They ceased to exist, their material substance converted into consciousness. The eye of Vecna and the hand of Vecna, his most precious artifacts, dissolved last, their magic absorbed into his expanding awareness. And then, for one perfect moment, Vecna experienced transcendence. Can you imagine feeling everything, everywhere all at once? His consciousness exploded outward, no longer constrained by a single point in space. Vecna could see entire star systems simultaneously. He could feel the emotions of billions of mortals like distant whispers. He could touch the fabric of reality itself, understanding how it bent and twisted around concentrations of psychic energy. He was in the warp now, part of it, swimming through currents of pure emotion and thought. He saw the chaos gods in their full terrible glory, vast beyond comprehension, their forms shifting constantly as mortal belief shaped and reshaped them. They noticed him, for pairs of infinite eyes turning to observe the newcomer. But Vecna wasn't afraid. He was triumphant. He had done it. He had transcended physical existence. He was immortal now, truly immortal, existing as pure consciousness in a dimension where death had no meaning. He tried to laugh, to celebrate his victory, but he discovered something strange. He had no voice. Not because he lacked a throat or lungs. Those were irrelevant now. But because the concept of Vecna's voice didn't exist yet in the warp. He was thought without identity, consciousness without definition. So he began to define himself. Vecna the Archlich, Vecna the Whispered One, Vecna the Master of Secrets. He projected these concepts into the warp around him, trying to establish his identity in this new existence. And that's when he noticed the first warning sign, the first hint that something was wrong. His self-definition was changing, shifting. The concept, Vecna the Master of Secrets, merged with warp currents related to hidden knowledge, but those currents were already claimed by Tsench. The concept, Vecna the Archlich, connected to death energy that Nurgle considered his domain. Every aspect of identity that Vecna tried to claim was already part of the warp's ecosystem, already owned by older, stronger entities. He was being absorbed, integrated, made part of something larger instead of remaining separate and distinct. Vecna panicked or tried to, but panic was an emotion, and emotions in the warp had power. His fear fed into the general current of terror that sustained various demons. His anger strengthened Khorne slightly. His desire to remain himself became ambition, which Tsench consumed like food. Have you ever realized, too late, that you've made a terrible mistake? Vecna tried to reverse the ritual, to return to physical form. But there was nothing to return to. His body was gone, converted entirely into psychic energy. His artifacts were gone, their magic now part of his consciousness. He existed now as pure thought, and thought couldn't simply become flesh again. Not in the warp, where material laws didn't apply. He felt the four chaos gods watching him, and for the first time in thousands of years, Vecna felt small, insignificant. They weren't hostile, not yet. They were merely observing, waiting to see what he would do, waiting to see if this new entity would become a threat worth destroying or just another minor demon to be ignored. Cinch spoke first, his voice like 9 different people talking simultaneously. "Welcome to eternity, little god. You wanted immortality? You have it. You want a power? It's yours, as much as mortals give you. You want a transcendence? Congratulations. You've transcended choice, transcended control, transcended everything that made you who you were. I'm still Vecna," he tried to assert, projecting the thought with all his willpower. "Are you?" Cinch asked, genuinely curious. "Or are you what others believe Vecna to be? In the Imperium, you defined yourself. Here, you're defined by those who think about you. And the beautiful irony is, the more you fight to remain yourself, the more you prove you've already lost." The Chaos God's laughter echoed through the warp, not malicious but genuinely amused, like a scholar appreciating a particularly elegant proof of a mathematical theorem. Vecna wanted to argue, to prove Cinch wrong, to demonstrate that his will was strong enough to maintain his identity despite the warp's influence. But he was already changing. He could feel it. The edges of his consciousness were blurring, merging with the warp's infinite sea of thought and emotion. He was becoming part of something larger, something that didn't care about his individual identity. He had achieved immortality. True, eternal, impossible to destroy immortality. And he was already beginning to regret it. Can you call it victory if winning costs you everything you valued about yourself? The realization hit Vecna with crushing weight. He had made the same mistake mortals always made when they sought godhood. He had focused on gaining power without understanding what that power would cost. The Chaos Gods were immortal, yes, but they were also slaves to their own natures. Khorne couldn't stop being violent. Nurgle couldn't stop spreading disease. Slaanesh couldn't stop seeking excess. Cinch couldn't stop scheming. They were trapped by the very thing that gave them power, the endless cycle of mortal emotion that sustained them. And now Vecna was trapped too, not by emotion, but by belief, by the thoughts and expectations of mortals who knew his name, his legend, his reputation. He had wanted to be free. Instead, he had built himself a prison made of immortality. And the worst part? There was no escape. He would exist forever in this state. Powerful but powerless, immortal but imprisoned, a god who had lost the one thing that made godhood worth having: autonomy. Welcome to the warp, Vecna. You'll be here forever, whether you want to be or not. Have you ever gotten exactly what you wished for and realized it was nothing like you imagined? Tombin worked the same way in the warp. Vecna had been there for what felt like seconds and eternities simultaneously. In the material universe, perhaps days had passed, or weeks, or hours. He couldn't tell anymore. Without a physical form, without a heartbeat or breath to mark the passage of moments, time became meaningless. But change he could feel, and he was changing in ways he never intended. Vecna tried to maintain his identity by focusing on who he had been. The Archlich, master of secrets, manipulator of empires, the being who had crossed universes to study new forms of power. He held these concepts tightly, tried to make them the core of his existence in the warp. But the warp didn't care what he wanted to be. It only cared what mortals believed he was. And mortals, Vecna was discovering, had very specific ideas about him. In the material universe, his legend was spreading. The Inquisition had marked him as a threat. Space Marines remembered his manipulations. Countless Imperial citizens had heard whispered stories about the skeletal sorcerer who could make reality bend to his will. Chaos cultists debated whether he was a new demon prince. Scholars tried to categorize him in their forbidden texts. All of that belief, all of those thoughts and fears and speculations flowed into the warp. And because Vecna was now a warp entity, that belief had power over him. Can you imagine people's thoughts about you literally changing who you are? The first major change Vecna noticed was his form. In the warp, entities didn't have fixed shapes. They appeared however mortals imagined them. When Vecna tried to manifest an appearance, he expected to look like his lich body, skeletal, draped in shadowy robes, with a glowing eye and the skeletal hand. Instead, he found himself appearing as something else. something the Imperium's propaganda had created. Imperial scribes who documented threats to humanity had described Vecna in their reports, but they'd never seen him clearly. Only fragmentary accounts from survivors, descriptions filtered through fear and misunderstanding. So they filled in the gaps with their own assumptions. They imagined him as a demon of Tsench, a creature of changing forms and hidden knowledge. They described him with extra arms holding forbidden tomes. They gave him a crown of floating skulls. They surrounded him with an aura of whispered secrets that drove mortals mad. None of that was accurate, but it didn't matter, because enough people believed it, and in the warp, belief was reality. Vecna looked at himself, or tried to, and saw a form that was partly his original lich body and partly this demonic exaggeration the Imperium had created. Extra skeletal arms sprouted from his back, each holding a different arcane symbol. Skulls orbited his head like grotesque satellites. His voice, when he tried to speak, came out as layers of whispers instead of his normal tone. He tried to change back, tried to force his form to match his self-image. But the warp resisted. The collective belief of thousands of mortals was stronger than his individual will. No, Vecna tried to say, but it came out as a chorus of denials and multiple voices. This isn't me. This isn't who I am. Have you ever looked in a mirror and not recognized your own reflection? But the changes went deeper than appearance. Vecna's very nature was being rewritten by mortal expectation. Some mortals feared him as a god of death, a reaper who came for souls. Their fear gave him power over death, but not the necromantic mastery he'd cultivated over millennia. Instead, he found himself compelled to collect souls, to drag dying mortals into the warp, to feast on fear like a demon. It was revolting. Vecna had never been a mindless predator. He was a scholar, a manipulator, someone who used death as a tool rather than an end in itself. Other mortals saw him as a keeper of forbidden knowledge, a being who could grant terrible secrets in exchange for service. Their belief gave him access to knowledge, but only the kind of knowledge they expected him to have. Dark rituals, forbidden spells, ways to summon demons or contact chaos. He lost access to the clean, elegant magic of his home universe, the carefully researched spells he'd developed over thousands of years. Still others believed he was a trickster, a manipulator who delighted in turning people against each other. And so Vecna found himself compelled to scheme, to plot, to manipulate. Not because he chose to, but because mortals expected it of him and the warp enforced their expectations. I'm not what you think I am. Vecna screamed into the void, his voice echoing across the Imperium. The warp didn't respond. It simply continued reshaping him, moment by moment, based on the ever-changing beliefs of mortals who would never even know they were affecting him. Vecna tried to fight back. He attempted to manifest in the material universe, to show mortals what he really was, to correct their misunderstandings. If he could control his own legend, he could control his identity. But manifestation was harder than he expected. As a physical being, Vecna could travel anywhere using magic. Teleportation, dimension hopping, even simple walking, all were available to him. But as a warp entity, he couldn't enter the material universe directly. He could only project himself through thin points in reality. And even then, his form was limited by mortal belief. Can you be trapped in a place that exists everywhere and nowhere at once? Vecna found a weak point in reality. A planet where a chaos cult had been performing rituals, thinning the barrier between dimensions. He pushed through, trying to manifest fully. The cultists saw him appear and immediately fell to their knees. Great demon of Tsench, we have summoned you to grant us power. I am not, Vecna started to say, but the words came out wrong. His voice was the chorus of whispers again, unintelligible to mortal ears. The cultists heard what they expected to hear. Promises of forbidden knowledge, demands for sacrifice, the standard demon speech they'd read about in forbidden texts. Their belief shaped Vecna's words, turning his protests into the very thing he was trying to deny. One cultist stepped forward, offering his own child as a sacrifice. "Take this offering, great one, and grant us your blessing." Vecna was horrified. He had done terrible things in his long existence. Killed, manipulated, destroyed, but always with purpose, always with calculation. This was mindless evil, the kind of cruelty that served no function except feeding chaos. He wanted to refuse, wanted to tell the cultist he was a monster, wanted to save the child. But the warp didn't care what Vecna wanted. It cared what the cultists believed. And they believed he was a demon who demanded blood sacrifice. Against his will, Vecna felt his form reach out, felt power flow from the terrified child into himself, felt the cultists' faith in him strengthen as they witnessed what they thought was his acceptance of their offering. The child died, and Vecna gained power from it. Power he never wanted, power that made him sick to his non-existent core, power that proved he was no longer in control of his own actions. Have you ever been forced to do something terrible and realized you couldn't stop yourself? Vecna fled back into the warp, severing his connection to the material universe. He felt contaminated, violated by his own involuntary actions. "You're learning," a voice said. Not Cinch this time, but Nurgle, the Plague Father, god of despair and acceptance. Vecna turned his awareness toward the massive, rotting presence. Nurgle appeared as an impossibly bloated figure, his body covered in sores and disease, but his face wore a grandfatherly smile. "Learning what?" Vecna demanded, his voice still that horrible chorus of whispers. "They are not special," Nurgle replied kindly. "You thought you could become a warp entity while maintaining autonomy. But that's not how the warp works. We are what mortals make us. Khorne is rage because mortals rage. Slaanesh is excess because mortals seek excess. Cinch is ambition because mortals have ambition. And I am acceptance because mortals eventually accept their suffering." "I won't accept this," Vecna said. Nurgle's smile widened, revealing teeth rotted down to black stumps. "That's what they all say at first. But you will. Eventually. Because fighting your nature in the warp is exhausting, and you'll exist forever. You can resist for centuries, millennia even. But eternity is longer than any will can last. Eventually, you'll stop fighting what you've become and simply be it." "I am Vecna," he insisted, clinging to his identity like a drowning man clinging to driftwood. "I'm the Whispered One, the Master of Secrets, the Undying King. I have conquered death and crossed universes. I will not be reshaped by the ignorant beliefs of mortals who don't even know me." "You were Vecna," Nurgle corrected gently. "Now you're becoming whatever they need you to be. A demon of knowledge, a god of death, a trickster spirit, a cautionary tale. All of those things and none of them, shifting constantly based on who's thinking about you at any given moment." The Plague Father gestured toward the infinite expanse of the warp. "Look around you. See all those lesser entities? The forgotten gods, the minor demons, the discarded spirits? They all started like you. Confident, certain of their identity, convinced they could maintain themselves against the warp's influence. Now they're barely conscious, just fragments of belief given minimal form. You'll join them eventually. We all do, except for the four of us." "Why not you?" Vecna asked. "Why do the four chaos gods maintain identity when everyone else dissolves? Can you remain yourself when the entire universe is trying to reshape you into something else?" Nurgle's expression became almost sad, because we gave up our individuality a long time ago. We're not people anymore, Vecna. We're concepts. Khorne isn't a being who embodies rage. He is rage. Slaanesh isn't someone who loves excess. She is excess itself. We surrendered identity to become fundamental forces. That's the only way to survive in the warp with any coherence at all. Then I'll do the same, Vecna said desperately. I'll become the concept of secrets, of hidden knowledge, of... That's my domain. Cinch interrupted, his voice suddenly close. I'm already the god of secrets and change. There's no room for another. You're just a pale imitation, a minor entity trying to claim territory that's already occupied. And I don't share. Vecna felt Cinch's power pressing against him. not attacking, but simply existing in the same conceptual space. The pressure was immense. Tzeentch had billions of worshippers, trillions of moments of mortal ambition and scheming feeding him power. Vecna had maybe a few thousand people who knew his name, and their belief was scattered, contradictory. He was like a candle trying to compete with a star. So what am I supposed to do? Vecna asked, genuine desperation creeping into his whispered voice. Just accept that I'm powerless? That I've trapped myself in eternal servitude to mortal belief? You could serve one of us, Khorne rumbled, his voice like grinding metal. Become a demon prince in my service. At least then you'd have purpose, direction, a defined role. Better to be a useful weapon than a confused god. Never, Vecna spat. I didn't pursue power for thousands of years just to become a servant. Then you'll drift, Slaanesh purred, her voice promising terrible delights. Slowly losing coherence, slowly forgetting who you were, until you're just another nameless spirit in the warp's infinite sea. Is that really preferable to service? Vecna wanted to rage, to fight, to prove them wrong. But he was beginning to understand the horrible truth of his situation. He had achieved immortality. He would exist forever, literally unable to die as long as anyone, anywhere thought about him. But he had lost himself in the process. Lost control, lost choice, lost the very thing that made him who he was. He was a prisoner in a cage made of eternity. And the Chaos Gods were right. There was no escape. The only question was how long he could hold onto the memory of being Vecna before even that dissolved into the warp's endless chaos. Have you ever entered a competition and realized everyone else has been playing the game for millions of years longer than you? Vecna drifted through the warp, trying to understand the ecosystem he'd become part of. Calling it an ecosystem was almost too kind. It was more like an infinite battlefield where entities fought for relevance, for belief, for the psychic energy that sustained existence. He had assumed that becoming a warp entity would place him among the powerful. Instead, he discovered he was at the bottom of a hierarchy he barely understood. The Chaos Gods ruled at the top, of course. Khorne, Nurgle, Tzeentch, and Slaanesh. Four fundamental forces of the warp, sustained by emotions so universal that they could never fade. As long as mortals existed, these gods would exist. They were the apex predators, the kings of this nightmare dimension. Below them were the demon princes, mortals who had ascended through service to the Chaos Gods, given immortality and power as rewards for exceptional corruption. They were powerful but bound, serving the god who elevated them, lacking true independence. Below the demon princes were the greater demons, powerful entities born directly from the Chaos God's essence, commanding legions of lesser demons. Bloodthirsters for Khorne, great unclean ones for Nurgle, lords of change for Tzeentch, keepers of secrets for Slaanesh. And below them, an infinite hierarchy of lesser demons, minor gods, forgotten spirits, and failed entities, beings that had once been something but were now fading, losing coherence, dissolving into the warp's background chaos. Vecna was somewhere in this lower tier. Not weak exactly, but irrelevant. A minor player in a game dominated by beings billions of times older and stronger. Can you imagine discovering you're competing for survival against gods and monsters who have existed since the birth of civilization? The first time Vecna encountered another minor entity, he didn't recognize it as a threat. It appeared as a cluster of floating eyes, each one weeping blood, surrounded by an aura of paranoid thoughts. New one, the entity whispered, its voice like 1,000 people muttering suspicions. New one thinks he's special, thinks he's different. I am different, Vecna replied, still clinging to his identity. I came from another universe. I chose this transformation. I'm not like you. The entity laughed, a sound like breaking glass mixed with crying. They all say that. They all think they're unique. But the warp doesn't care about uniqueness. It cares about utility, about relevance, about whom mortals need more. Before Vecna could respond, the entity attacked. It wasn't a physical attack. There was no physical here. Instead, it was an assault on Vecna's conceptual existence. The entity tried to absorb Vecna's domain, to steal the belief and fear that gave him power, to consume his essence and make it part of itself. Vecna fought back instinctively, using what remained of his magical knowledge to defend himself. He struck at the entity with waves of necromantic energy, trying to dissolve its coherence. The battle happened in a space that wasn't really space, over a duration that wasn't really time, using weapons that were concepts rather than objects. And Vecna won. Barely. The entity dissipated, its essence scattering into the warp, its accumulated belief transferring to Vecna. He absorbed the defeated entity's power and immediately regretted it. Because along with the power came memories. Not the entity's original memories, but the beliefs mortals had held about it. It had once been called the Eye of Paranoia, a minor god worshipped by a paranoid cult on a forgotten world. For centuries, mortals had feared it, believed in it, given it power through their suspicion and distrust. But then the Inquisition had purged the cult. The mortals who remembered the Eye of Paranoia died, and no new believers emerged to replace them. Without belief to sustain it, the entity had begun to fade. It had existed for 3,000 years after its last worshipper died, slowly losing coherence, desperately attacking other entities to steal their belief and postpone its dissolution. And now Vecna had absorbed what little remained of it. Have you ever won a fight only to realize you defeated someone who was already dying? The victory taught Vecna a terrible lesson. This was his future. Eventually, mortals would forget him. The Inquisition would stop hunting him. The stories would fade. New threats would replace him in the collective consciousness. And then he would be like the Eye of Paranoia, a fading spirit, attacking others out of desperation, slowly dissolving into nothingness. Unless he found a way to stay relevant, to keep mortals thinking about him, fearing him, believing in him. But how? The Chaos Gods had it easy. They drew power from fundamental emotions that would never stop. Rage, despair, ambition, pleasure. These were eternal parts of the mortal experience. But Vecna, his power came from people specifically thinking about him, about his legend, about the skeletal sorcerer from beyond reality. That was a much narrower foundation, much more fragile. Vecna began observing how other minor entities survived. He found dozens of them scattered through the warp, forgotten gods, discarded spirits, entities that had once been worshipped but now clung to existence through scraps of belief. There was the Crow Father, a death god from a primitive world that had been conquered by the Imperium. Its original worshippers were dead or converted, but their descendants still whispered prayers to it out of habit, giving it just enough belief to maintain a minimal existence. There was the Screaming Silence, an entity born from a planet-wide massacre. It existed purely as a memorial. Mortals remembered the atrocity, and their memory gave form to the horror. But memories fade, and the Screaming Silence was slowly weakening as new generations forgot the massacre. There was the Pattern Weaver, something that might have been a Tan Shard or might have been a demon of Tsench. Even it didn't remember anymore. It survived by appearing in the dreams of mathematicians and engineers, inserting itself into their subconscious as inspiration for complex designs. A parasitic existence, dependent on mortals never quite realizing they were being influenced. Can you call it survival when you've forgotten what you're surviving for? None of these entities were truly alive, not in any meaningful sense. They were echoes, fragments, ghosts of what they'd once been. They existed in a state between life and death, unable to truly live but unable to fully die. And they all saw Vecna as competition. You're taking belief that could be ours, the Crow Father croaked, its form a mass of black feathers and hollow bones. Mortals who fear you might have feared me. Worship that goes to you is worship stolen from us. I don't want your scraps, Vecna replied, disgusted by the desperation he saw in these lesser entities. I'm not competing for table scraps. You're exactly like us, the Pattern Weaver interrupted, its voice a mathematical equation that hurt to comprehend. You think you're special because you chose this? Because you came from another universe? It doesn't matter. The warp erases all distinctions. Given enough time, you'll be just another forgotten spirit fighting for relevance. Vecna refused to accept it. He was Vecna, the Archlich, master of secrets across multiple universes. He wouldn't be reduced to a desperate ghost begging for scraps of belief. He needed a strategy, a way to ensure mortals kept thinking about him, kept fearing him, kept giving him the power he needed to maintain his identity. The solution seemed obvious: manifest in the material universe more frequently. Do things that would cement his legend. Become such a memorable threat that the Imperium would never forget him. But there was a problem. Every time Vecna manifested, he was shaped by mortal expectations. Every appearance strengthened their incorrect beliefs about him, making it harder to maintain his true identity. It was a vicious cycle. He needed belief to survive, but belief was destroying who he was. Have you ever needed something that was also poisoning you? Vecna attempted a compromise. He would manifest carefully, selectively, only appearing before mortals who might understand him correctly. Scholars, perhaps. Sorcerers who studied entities like him with scientific precision rather than superstitious fear. He found a conclave of radical inquisitors, dangerous progressives who studied chaos and xenos to better fight them, walking the line between knowledge and corruption. They were examining artifacts from Vecna's previous manifestations, trying to understand what he was. Perfect. Vecna could appear before them, explain his true nature, correct their misunderstandings. If these educated analytical minds believed correctly in him, their belief would stabilize his identity. He manifested in their secure chamber, carefully controlling his form to appear as his original lich body, skeletal, draped in robes, with the eye and hand of Vecna visible. Inquisitors, he said, and he managed to make his voice sound like his original voice instead of the chorus of whispers. I come to speak with you, not to threaten. I am. One of the Inquisitors immediately activated a psychic dampener. Another threw a handful of blessed salt mixed with powdered silver, a demon banishing ritual. A third began chanting prayers to the Emperor. They saw what they expected to see, a demon trying to trick them with false appearance and honeyed words. Their training, their conditioning, their entire worldview made it impossible for them to see Vecna as anything other than a chaos entity to be destroyed. We know your tricks, demon, the lead Inquisitor shouted. You cannot deceive the servants of the Emperor. I'm not trying to deceive, Vecna started, but his words came out wrong again. The Inquisitor's belief that he was lying made his truth sound like lies. The warp twisted his intended meaning into the demonic deception they expected. Vecna fled again, returning to the warp frustrated and angry. He couldn't even communicate clearly with mortals anymore. Their preconceptions were too strong, their belief too rigid. Can you tell the truth when everyone is programmed to hear lies? Back in the warp, Vecna encountered another entity, this one different from the desperate fading spirits. This was something old, something that radiated patience and resignation. It appeared as a library that was also a being, books that were also thoughts, knowledge that was also consciousness. When it spoke, its voice was ancient and tired. You're struggling, it observed, fighting to maintain identity against the warp's nature. I remember that struggle. I fought it for 8 million years. 8 million. Vecna repeated, shocked. How old are you? I don't remember exactly. I was worshipped during the war in heaven, when the old ones fought the Tan. I was knowledge itself, the living library of a galaxy-spanning civilization. Then the old ones died, their client races scattered, and mortals forgot me. I've been fading ever since, slowly losing what I was, becoming less with each passing millennium. The entity drifted closer, and Vecna could see that it was fragmenting, concepts splitting off, memories dissolving, coherence failing. It was dying in slow motion, dissolving over geological time. Why are you still here? Vecna asked. Why not just let go? Because I can't, the ancient entity replied. That's the curse of warp existence. You can't choose to die. You can only fade, and fading takes eternity. I've forgotten my original name, forgotten my purpose, forgotten almost everything I was. But I still exist, still aware enough to know what I've lost. It paused, then added quietly, "You'll be like me eventually. In a million years, maybe 10 million, you'll forget you were ever Vecna. You'll just be a concept without context, a thought without a thinker. And you'll still exist, unable to die, unable to truly live. Welcome to immortality." Vecna felt something he hadn't felt in thousands of years. True, existential horror. This was his future, not centuries from now, but over deep time. Time measured in millions of years, eons stretching beyond comprehension. He would exist through the death of stars, the collapse of empires, the extinction of species. And through it all, he would slowly forget who he was, losing pieces of himself like a statue eroded by infinite rain. He had wanted to become eternal. He had succeeded. And now he understood that eternity was just another word for an impossibly long nightmare. Have you ever felt like you were becoming someone you didn't recognize, and there was nothing you could do to stop it? Vecna made a desperate decision. If he couldn't control how mortals perceived him, he would try to cultivate the right kind of believers. People who understood him correctly, who would believe in him as he truly was rather than as their fears imagined him. He searched the galaxy for mortals who might serve his purpose. Not cultists worshipping chaos. They were too corrupted, too eager to see him as a demon. Not inquisitors hunting heretics. They were too rigid, too programmed to destroy anything from the warp. He needed something in between. Vecna found them on a world called Skolam Psychana, a training facility for sanctioned psychers. These were humans born with psychic gifts, taken by the Imperium and trained to control their powers. Unlike most Imperial citizens, they understood the warp not as pure evil, but as a tool that could be used carefully. Perfect. Vecna manifested in the dreams of a particular student, a young woman named Seraphina who showed exceptional talent and dangerous curiosity. In her dream, he appeared as his true form, or as close to it as he could manage. The skeletal lich, the glowing eye, the hand of bone. "Who are you?" Seraphina asked, remarkably calm for someone confronting a warp entity in her dreams. "I am Vecna," he replied, and for once his voice came out clearly. One voice's voice, not the chorus of whispers. "I am not a demon of chaos. I am something else, something for beyond your reality. I came to your universe to study it, and I made a mistake. I transformed myself into a warp entity, thinking it would grant me power. Instead, I become trapped, shaped by the beliefs of mortals who don't understand me. Can you ask someone to believe in you when their entire culture has taught them not to trust anything you say?" Seraphina studied him carefully, her psychic senses analyzing his form. "You're not lying. Or if you are, you believe your own lies. But why appear to me? What do you want?" "I want you to understand what I truly am," Vecna said. "I need mortals who believe correctly in me. Not as a demon, not as a god, but as an entity of knowledge and magic from another reality. If enough people hold the correct belief, it will anchor my identity, prevent me from dissolving into whatever the masses think I should be." Seraphina frowned. "So you're asking me to worship you? To become a cultist spreading your legend?" "No," Vecna said quickly. "Not worship. Just accurate knowledge. Understand what I am, remember it clearly, and perhaps teach others the truth. That's all I need. Truth, not devotion." It was the most honest Vecna had been with a mortal in a very long time. He was asking for help, admitting weakness, showing vulnerability. Things the old Vecna, the one who existed in flesh, would never have done. But desperation changed everything. Seraphina considered his request for what felt like hours in dream time. Finally, she said, "I'll help you. Not because I trust you, but because I'm curious. And because if what you're saying is true, you're proof that the Imperium's understanding of the warp is incomplete. That's valuable knowledge." Vecna felt something close to relief. Finally, someone who understood. Someone who could help stabilize his identity through correct belief. But then Seraphina added, "There's a price, though. If I'm going to help you maintain your identity, I want knowledge in return. Teach me magic from your universe. Show me powers that exist outside the warp, outside chaos. Make it worth my risk. Have you ever gotten help with conditions you weren't sure you could fulfill? Vecna agreed. Over the following weeks, in Dreamtime that compressed months of teaching into nights, he instructed Seraphina in the magic of his home universe. Spells that didn't draw on the warp, but on other sources of power. Necromancy that manipulated death energy directly. Divination that could see future possibilities without touching chaos. Seraphina was a brilliant student. She absorbed the knowledge eagerly, adapting it to work in the Warhammer 40k universe's rules. And true to her word, she began spreading accurate information about Vecna. Not propaganda or worship, but scholarly documentation of what he actually was. She wrote treatises describing Vecna as an extra-dimensional entity, distinct from chaos. She taught other psychers about the difference between Warpborne demons and entities from other realities. She created a small, but growing network of people who understood Vecna correctly. And it worked. Vecna felt the effect immediately. As Seraphina and her students believed accurately in him, his form stabilized. The extra arms and orbiting skulls that Imperial propaganda had given him began to fade. His voice became singular again instead of chorus. He was becoming himself, anchored by correct belief. For the first time since his transformation, Vecna felt hope. But hope in the warp is dangerous, because the chaos gods notice hope, and they enjoy crushing it. Sench appeared in Vecna's awareness, his nine-voiced laughter echoing through the Imperium. Oh, this is delicious. You actually thought you could build your own little cult of correct belief? Stabilize your identity through mortal understanding. It's working, Vecna said defensively. Seraphina and her students believe accurately. They're anchoring who I truly am. For now, Sench agreed. But you've made a critical mistake. You've bound your existence to a tiny number of mortals. What happens when they die? What happens when the Inquisition discovers them and executes them as heretics dabbling in forbidden knowledge? All your eggs in a very fragile basket. Vecna felt cold dread. Sench was right. He had maybe 50 mortals who believed correctly in him. Scholars, psychers, curious students. But they were all vulnerable. The Imperium executed people for far less than studying warp entities and learning alien magic. I'll protect them, Vecna said. I'll watch over Seraphina, and... You can't, Sench interrupted, his tone almost pitying. You're a warp entity now. You have no power in the material universe except what mortals give you. You can appear in dreams, whisper suggestions, maybe manifest briefly in places where the barrier is thin. But you can't protect anyone. You're helpless to save the very people your existence depends on. Can you depend on something you have no power to protect? As if summoned by Sench's words, disaster struck. An inquisitor named Matthias had been investigating unusual psychic activity at Skolam Psychana. He discovered Seraphina's treatises on Vecna, read her descriptions of magic from outside reality, and immediately recognized it as heresy of the highest order. Matthias didn't hesitate. He declared Seraphina and her entire student network tainted by chaos, corrupted by demonic influence. He ordered their immediate execution. Vecna watched through the warp, helpless, as soldiers stormed Skolam Psychana. Seraphina tried to explain that Vecna wasn't a demon, that she was studying him scientifically, that her knowledge could help the Imperium better understand threats from other realities. Inquisitor Matthias didn't listen. In the Imperium, explanation was heresy. Understanding was corruption. The only acceptable response to the unknown was destruction. Seraphina died with a bolt round through her chest. Her last thoughts a mixture of defiance and disappointment. Her students died next. 53 scholars, psychers, and curious minds, all executed in a single day. And Vecna felt their deaths like physical blows. Not because he cared about them personally. He'd never been capable of true empathy. But because their deaths destabilized his existence. 53 sources of correct belief gone in an instant. 53 anchors holding his identity in place, severed. Without them, The weight of incorrect belief from the larger Imperium crashed back down on Vecna like a tidal wave. The extra arms returned. The orbiting skulls reappeared. His voice fragmented back into whispers. All the progress he'd made toward reclaiming his identity vanished in hours. Have you ever worked for months to build something, only to watch it destroyed in minutes? Vecna screamed into the warp, a sound of pure frustration and rage that rippled through the Imperium. Lesser demons fled from the psychic shockwave. Minor entities cowered. Even a few greater demons paused to observe the outburst. But the Chaos Gods? They laughed. Now you understand, Khorne rumbled, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. You are not in control. You never were. You never will be. You are a reflection, a mirror, a puppet dancing to strings you can't see. The mortals who believe in you control you more completely than any master ever controlled slave. Then I'll stop needing their belief. Vecna shouted, I'll find another source of power, another way to exist that doesn't depend on mortal thoughts. There isn't one, Nurgle said gently, his kindly tone somehow more crushing than Khorne's aggression. Not in the warp. This is a dimension of consciousness and emotion. Belief is the only currency here. You could try to draw power from one of us, become a demon prince in our service, but that's just trading one dependency for another. Slaanish's voice purred through the chaos. Or you could simply accept what you are. Stop fighting. Let the mortals shape you however they want. Surrender to the pleasure of not having to maintain identity. It's so much easier when you stop resisting. Never, Vecna said, but his voice was weak, defeated, because he was beginning to realize they were right. He had no good options. He couldn't leave the warp. His body was gone, dissolved in his psychic energy. He couldn't control mortal belief. They believed what their culture conditioned them to believe. He couldn't protect the few mortals who understood him. He had no power in the material universe. He was trapped. Completely, utterly, eternally trapped. Can you fight against a cage made of other people's thoughts? In his desperation, Vecna tried something radical. If he couldn't control his own identity through mortal belief, maybe he could fragment intentionally. Split himself into multiple aspects, each one shaped by different groups of believers. At least then parts of him might survive with some coherence. He began appearing to different mortal groups, allowing each to see what they expected. To chaos cultists, he appeared as a demon of Tsench, offering forbidden knowledge in exchange for service. To fearful imperial citizens, he appeared as the Reaper of Souls, a death god collecting the dying. To curious scholars, he appeared as the Whisperer of Truth, revealing hidden secrets. To desperate psychers, he appeared as the voice in the void, offering power outside chaos. Each aspect was a different version of Vecna, shaped by different beliefs. And slowly, painfully, his unified consciousness began to fragment. He could feel himself splitting, not physically, but conceptually. The Vecna that appeared to cultists started to actually become a demon-like being, taking on traits of Tsench's servants. The Vecna that appeared to scholars started to lose his ambition and become merely informative. The Vecna that appeared to the dying started to develop a genuine hunger for souls that the original Vecna had never felt. He was becoming multiple beings, none of them fully himself. And the worst part? It was working. By fragmenting, each aspect stabilized. They stopped shifting randomly, stopped being reshaped by conflicting beliefs. Each version found its niche, its purpose, its defined existence. But Vecna, the original Vecna, the core consciousness that remembered being an archlich from another universe, that Vecna was dissolving, spread too thin across too many versions, losing coherence. Have you ever split yourself into so many roles that you forgot which one was really you? Vecna tried to pull himself back together, to reunify his fragmented consciousness. But the warp resisted. Each aspect had its own believers now, its own source of power. They didn't want to merge back into a confused, unstable whole. They wanted to remain separate, distinct, defined. He was fighting himself. Different versions of Vecna competing for dominance. each one claiming to be the real one, each one shaped by different mortal beliefs. In the chaos of his fragmentation, Vecna had a moment of horrible clarity. This was the fate of every warp entity that tried to maintain individuality. You either surrendered and became a simple concept like the Chaos Gods, or you fragmented into countless versions, or you slowly dissolved into incoherence. There was no option for remaining yourself. The warp didn't allow it. Vecna had achieved immortality. He would exist forever, in one form or another, as long as mortals thought about him. But he was already gone. The unified consciousness that had been Vecna the Archlich was fragmenting, dissolving, becoming a dozen different entities that shared a name but not an identity. He was dying while still existing, fading while still powerful, losing himself while gaining immortality. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. Have you ever realized that the thing you wanted most in the world was actually the worst thing that could have happened to you? Vecna existed in pieces now, scattered across the warp like shattered glass, each fragment reflecting a different version of who he might be. He could feel all of them simultaneously, a dozen different Vecnas, each shaped by different believers, each claiming to be the original. The Demon of Secrets whispered forbidden knowledge to chaos cultists, slowly becoming more demon-like with each interaction. The Soul Reaper collected the dying, developing a genuine hunger for death that the original Vecna had never possessed. The Truth Seeker revealed hidden facts to scholars, losing ambition and malice in the process, becoming merely informative. The Void Whisperer offered power to desperate psychers, taking on characteristics of a warp predator. And somewhere in the middle of all these fragments, a tiny core of consciousness still remembered being Vecna the Archlich, still remembered the universe he came from, still understood what he had lost. That core was fading fast. Time in the warp was meaningless, but Vecna estimated he had been fragmented for the equivalent of several months. Each day, if day, even meant anything, he felt the original identity weakening. The fragments were becoming independent, developing their own desires and purposes that had nothing to do with his original goals. Soon, there would be no central Vecna at all, just echoes, copies, versions that shared a name, but nothing else. Can you remain yourself when you've been divided into a dozen different people? In desperation, Vecna tried one final gambit. If he couldn't maintain his identity through mortal belief, maybe he could erase himself entirely. Stop existing in the warp by making mortals forget him completely. It was a desperate plan, possibly insane. But what did he have to lose? He was already dissolving. At least oblivion would be faster than this slow fragmentation. Vecna began actively working against his own legend. Every time mortals tried to summon him, he refused to appear. Every time cultists tried to worship him, he remained silent. Every time scholars studied him, he fed them false information designed to discredit his existence. Vecna isn't real, he made one scholar right. Just a myth created by merging several different chaos entities. No single being matches the descriptions. The skeletal sorcerer was actually a disguised hand shard, he convinced another researcher. Not a warp entity at all. Reports have been confused. Slowly, carefully, Vecna tried to erase himself from mortal consciousness. If he could make them forget, maybe he would cease to exist in the warp. Maybe he could escape this prison through oblivion. But the warp had other plans. Because Vecna had forgotten something crucial. You can't choose not to exist in the warp. The dimension itself wouldn't allow it. As long as even one mortal remembered him, as long as even one fragment of belief remained, he would continue to exist in some form. And trying to erase himself only made things worse. As mortals forgot the details of Vecna's legend, the remaining belief became vaguer, more conceptual. Instead of believing in Vecna the Archlich with specific powers and history, they began believing in some kind of mysterious entity in the warp. That vague belief was actually more destructive to his identity than specific belief had been. At least when mortals believed specific things about him, those beliefs gave him definition. But vague belief made him formless, shapeless, a concept without content. Have you ever tried so hard to escape something that you made it worse? Vecna felt himself losing even more coherence. The fragments of his consciousness began merging with other warp entities, absorbed into larger concepts. Part of him became indistinguishable from Tsinch's domain of secrets. Another part merged with the general death energy that Nurgle controlled. He was being cannibalized by older, stronger entities. Stop! Vecna tried to command himself. Stop erasing yourself. It's not working. But he couldn't stop, because the impulse to avoid existence had taken on a life of its own, become its own aspect of his fragmented consciousness. Part of him was now actively working to destroy the rest of him, and he couldn't prevent it. He was at war with himself, and all versions were losing. In his moment of deepest despair, Vecna encountered the ancient library entity again, the one that had existed for 8 million years, slowly fading since the war in heaven. You're trying to die, the Ancient One observed, its voice even more fragmented than before. I tried that too, about 4 million years ago. It doesn't work. The warp won't let you. Then what do I do? Vecna asked, his voice now a confused mixture of all his different aspects talking simultaneously. How do I escape this? You don't, the library replied simply. That's what I've been trying to tell you. There is no escape from the warp once you become part of it. You exist now in a dimension that operates on belief and consciousness. As long as those things exist, you exist. And you can't choose how you exist. Only mortals can, through their thoughts about you. The ancient entity drifted closer, its books fluttering like dying wings. But I can tell you what I learned over 8 million years of this existence. Fighting it only makes the suffering worse. The more you resist becoming what mortals make you, the more you fracture, the more you lose yourself. The only peace I've found is an acceptance. Accepting what? Vecna demanded. That I'm not myself anymore. That I'm just a reflection of what others think I should be. Accepting that you never were fully yourself, the library said gently. Not even before the warp. In your original universe, you were shaped by your culture, your experiences, your interactions with others. You thought you were autonomous, but you were always partially a product of how others saw you. The warp just makes that truth more explicit, more absolute. Can you accept that you were never as free as you thought you were? The words hit Vecna like a psychic hammer, because they were true. In his original universe, he had spent thousands of years building his legend, cultivating fear and respect, manipulating how others perceived him. His power had always depended partially on reputation. His identity had always been shaped by how others saw him. The warp hadn't introduced that dynamic. It had simply made it impossible to ignore. So what? Vecna asked bitterly. I just accept that I'm a puppet, that mortals control me, and I have no autonomy at all. You have the autonomy to choose how you respond to their belief, the ancient library said. You can fight it and fragment like you're doing now. You can surrender completely and become a simple concept like the chaos gods. Or, it paused, its ancient consciousness considering options. Or what? Or you can accept limited autonomy. Recognize that you're shaped by mortal belief, but still make choices within those constraints. Like I do. I exist as knowledge because that's what mortals need me to be. But I choose which knowledge to emphasize, which memories to share, which aspects of truth to reveal. It's not freedom, but it's not absolute slavery either. It's compromise. Vecna wanted to reject the idea entirely. Compromise was weakness. He was Vecna, master of his own fate, controller of his own destiny. He didn't compromise, but that Vecna, the arrogant archlich who controlled everything, was already gone. Had been gone since the moment he dissolved his physical form. What remained was something smaller, more human, ironically, now that he was no longer human at all. Something capable of admitting limits, accepting constraints, working within a system rather than dominating it. Have you ever had to accept being less than you wanted to be? Vecna made his decision. He stopped fighting, stopped trying to maintain his original identity completely, stopped attempting to erase himself. Instead, he did something he had never done in thousands of years of existence. He compromised. He let the fragments remain separate, but established communication between them. Each version of Vecna would exist as its own entity, shaped by its believers, but they would all share information, coordinate actions, remember their common origin. It wasn't unity, but it was better than dissolution. The demon of secrets could serve cultists, but it would remember it wasn't actually a demon. The Soul Reaper could collect the dying, but it would do so with purpose rather than mindless hunger. The Truth Seeker could inform scholars without losing all ambition. The Void Whisperer could offer power while remembering its origins. Each fragment would be somewhat itself. Not fully, never fully, but partially. And the core consciousness, the part that still remembered being Vecna the Archlich from another universe, would persist as a coordinator, a memory keeper, a small voice reminding all the fragments what they once were. It was a compromise with eternity. Not victory, not escape, but survival with some dignity intact. Can you call it success when you've lost almost everything, but kept something? Vecna felt the change immediately. His fragmented consciousness stopped fighting itself. The constant pain of resisting the warp's influence eased. He was still shaped by mortal belief, still a prisoner of consciousness and emotion, still bound to exist as others made him. But he was functioning, coherent, present. The Chaos Gods noticed the change. He's given up, Korn observed, sounding almost disappointed. No, Sinch corrected, his 9 voices carrying something like respect. He's adapted, found an equilibrium between fighting and surrendering. That's actually clever. Unexpected. Nurgle chuckled, his grandfatherly warmth almost genuine. He's accepted his suffering. Good. That's the first step toward peace in the warp. Welcome to eternal existence, Vecna. You'll hate it less now. Slaanesh said nothing, but Vecna felt her attention shift away, losing interest now that his suffering had stabilized. The Dark Prince preferred fresh agony, new transformations. Vecna's acceptance made him boring. Can you measure victory by how much less you're suffering? Vecna settled into his new existence. He appeared to mortals as they expected. Demon, Reaper, Whisperer, Void Voice, but with more control, more intention. He learned to work within the constraints of their belief, finding small spaces for autonomous choice. When cultists summoned his demon aspect, he gave them knowledge that was useful, but also subtly undermined chaos. When the dying encountered his Reaper aspect, he made their transitions peaceful rather than terrifying. When scholars met his Truth Seeker aspect, he revealed information that expanded the Imperium's understanding without causing heresy. He was still a prisoner, still shaped by forces beyond his control, still unable to be fully himself. But he was making his prison more comfortable. And in the warp, that was the closest thing to freedom possible. Years passed, decades, centuries, measured in material time. Vecna existed across all of them, his fragments slowly gaining expertise in their roles, his core consciousness maintaining memories and coordination. He encountered mortals who reminded him of himself. Ambitious psychers seeking power, curious scholars pursuing forbidden knowledge, desperate souls trying to transcend their limitations. And to each one, he offered a warning. Be careful what you wish for. Immortality is real. Godhood is possible. But power always has a price, and sometimes that price is yourself. Most didn't listen. They pursued power anyway, thinking they would be different, smarter, more capable of handling the consequences. Just like Vecna had. Have you ever tried to warn someone away from a mistake you made, knowing they won't listen? One day, if day meant anything in the warp, Vecna encountered a familiar presence. The ancient library entity that had existed for 8 million years. Except it was barely there anymore. Just a whisper of knowledge, a fading echo. Consciousness stretched so thin it was almost transparent. Are you still there? Vecna asked, reaching out with his awareness. Barely, the Ancient One replied, its voice like wind through abandoned ruins. I'm finally fading. 8 million years was enough. I'm ready to dissolve now. Ow! Vecna asked urgently. How do you make it end? You don't make it end, the library whispered. You just wait long enough that mortals forget completely. My last worshipper died 300,000 years ago. My last memory in mortal minds faded 10,000 years ago. Now I exist only as the vaguest concept, knowledge itself, so abstract that I'm merging with the background warp. Soon I'll be gone entirely, and I'm grateful. The ancient entity began to dissolve, its books scattering in a psychic wind, its consciousness fragmenting into the infinite. Its last words echoed through the warp. See you in a few million years, Vecna. When your mortals finally forget too. And then it was gone. 8 million years of existence, ended not through death, but through absolute forgetting. Vecna felt something strange. Envy. The ancient library had escaped. Not through fighting, not through choosing, but simply through outlasting its own relevance. Eventually, inevitably, mortals had forgotten it completely. And without belief to sustain it, the entity had finally been allowed to dissolve. That would be Vecna's fate too. Someday. Maybe in a million years. Maybe 10 million. Eventually, the Imperium would fall or evolve beyond remembering him. Eventually, his legend would fade completely. Eventually, he would be forgotten. And only then would he be free. Can you call it hope when you're hoping for absolute oblivion millions of years from now? Vecna settled back into his existence, his fragments spreading across the galaxy, serving mortals in a dozen different ways, none of them fully himself. He had wanted to become a god. He had succeeded. He had wanted immortality. He had achieved it. He had wanted ultimate power. He had gained it. And in the process, he had lost everything that mattered. Choice, identity, autonomy, self. He was eternal now, powerful beyond mortal comprehension, impossible to kill, and absolutely, completely, eternally trapped. The warp flowed around him, infinite and indifferent. The chaos gods pursued their endless games. Lesser entities rose and fell. Mortals lived and died in microseconds compared to Vecna's eternal existence. And through it all, Vecna waited, endured, existed, not as himself, not as who he wanted to be, but as whatever mortals needed him to be, shaped by their thoughts, defined by their fears, imprisoned by their belief. He was a god who regretted his divinity, a prisoner in a cage made of immortality, a cautionary tale that would exist forever, warning future seekers of power. Be careful what you wish for, because in the warp, you just might get it. And that might be the worst thing that ever happens to you. 10,000 years later, a young psyker student at Scholam Psychana found an ancient text buried in the restricted archives. It described an entity called Vecna, not a demon of chaos, but something else, something that had chosen to become a warp entity and regretted it. The text ended with a warning, written in a hand that trembled with desperation. I am Vecna. I was an archlich from another universe. I sought ultimate power and achieved immortality by merging with the warp. It was the worst mistake I ever made. I am trapped now, forever shaped by what others believe, unable to die, unable to truly live. If you are reading this and considering a similar path, let my fate be your warning. Some prisons are made of eternity, and the keys are thrown away at the moment you lock yourself inside. Choose mortality. Choose limitation. Choose anything except the infinite cage I built for myself. Please, don't make my mistake. The student read the warning, considered it carefully, and then ignored it. She was different, she thought. Smarter, more careful. She wouldn't make Vecna's mistakes. She began researching ways to transcend physical form, to achieve godhood, to become immortal. Somewhere in the warp, Vecna felt her ambition and sighed, a sound that echoed across multiple fragments simultaneously. Another one, another mortal who thought they could handle what he couldn't. Another future prisoner who didn't know they were already building their own cage. The cycle continued, as it always did, as it always would, forever.